Hey, Mike here. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Dark Poutine early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Welcome back to Dark Poutine. I am Mike Brown.
And I am Matthew.
You are Matthew.
I beat you to it.
You did, but that's fine. How are things with you?
Can you hear Steve clomping around? So Steve is not getting as many walks or boat rides as he likes because I'm working full-time now.
Yeah.
So after the show today, he's going to go on a nice long ferry ride with me.
A nice long ferry ride. That sounds lovely.
Yeah.
I always make sure I like the photos that you post each week of Steve riding the ferry. He always looks so content.
He's so happy. He's never happier than when he's well fed and on a boat.
I'm kind of like that too.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during the Dark Poutine podcast are solely those of the producer and do not necessarily represent those of Curious Cast, its affiliate, Global News, nor their parent company, Chorus Entertainment.
Dark Poutine is not for the faint of heart or squeamish. Listener discretion is strongly advised. We're not experts on the topics we present, nor are we journalists. We're two ordinary Canadian schmucks chatting about crime and the dark side of history. Let's get to it. Put on your toque, grab yourself a double and a Nanaimo bar. It's time to scarf down some Dark Poutine.
You are responsible for obtaining and maintaining at your own cost all equipment needed to listen to Dark Poutine. Dark Poutine can be addictive. Side effects may include, but not be limited to, pausing and questioning the system, elevated heart rate, pondering humanity, odd looks from colleagues as you laugh out loud at work, family members not into true crime worrying about you. Positive side effects may include some perspectives and opinions that you disagree with, as well as some wokeness and empathy. If you don't think Dark Poutine is for you, consult your doctor immediately.
The tragic saga of Stephen Kiyoshk is one of Canada's most haunting tales of crime, retribution, and the complexities of the justice system. Spanning nearly 3 decades, the case includes double murder, dramatic trials, passionate community involvement, and finally an execution that left deep scars on Walpole Island and the greater Sarnia, Ontario area. The primary victims of this saga were Charles Nahdee and Adam Johns in the notorious 1912 double homicide, and decades later, Jerry Blackbird, whose violent death in 1939 led to Kiyoshk's execution. This is Dark Poutine episode 380, Twice and Again, the Walpole Island Murders. Walpole Island sits on the St. Clair River in southwestern Ontario. The island was first known to the indigenous people of the region as Bakajwanong, meaning where the waters divide. Archaeological evidence indicates that hunting, fishing, and seasonal villages have existed on the island for millennia, supported by its rich wetlands and abundant wildlife. The Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa people are the main nations who have called Walpole Island home. According to their traditions, these groups were once a single people, later forming the Three Fires Confederacy, a strong political and cultural alliance that shaped their history. The land was never formally ceded to the Crown, making Walpole Island unceded territory. By the late 1600s and the early 1700s, Ojibwe and Odawa families established permanent residence on the island. The Potawatomi made their homes there after 1836, when many indigenous families left the United States to avoid forced relocations and sought refuge with relatives and allies on the Canadian side. Early relationships with nearby European settlers were complex and often fraught with tension. In the early 19th century, indigenous people on Walpole Island supported the British during the War of 1812. After the war, migration from the United States brought new waves of indigenous families seeking safety. Throughout the 1800s, Europeans increased efforts to control Walpole Island. Jesuit missionaries arrived in 1844 without invitation, cutting down important oak groves. The community resisted, burned the mission, and the Jesuits left by 1850. Around the same time, non-indigenous industries cleared large parts of the island for timber, and colonial authorities tried to restrict indigenous hunting rights. Despite these pressures and growing mistrust, the people of Walpole Island held firm to their rights and traditions. By the end of the 19th century, Walpole Island was recognized as an independent First Nation. Traditional ways like hunting, fishing, and trapping remained part of daily life even as European settlement increased.
Yeah, it's really odd to think that my ancestors were there at this time.
Yeah.
During all of this, and that, you know, I'd love to say, oh, my family came later. We didn't do any of the bad shit, but they were the frontline colonists.
Of course.
They really were, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, you come to terms with that fact.
Sarnia is just kind of west of where you grew up, right? Nope. By the early 1900s, as it had for generations, the water, the land, and the woods continued to shape each day for the Chippewa and Ojibwe families on Walpole. Most of these people fished, trapped, and grew gardens. There were small log homes, dirt roads, and wide-open marshes. The island had its share of troubles. New settlers moved in from Sarnia and farther away. Laws came from Ottawa, but they felt far off. Local police were white men who didn't understand or want to understand the old ways. Many on the island spoke both English and Ojibwe. The language changed from house to house or even sentence to sentence. Some European settlers viewed the Chippewa as less than, and this was evident in both minor disputes and larger conflicts. Work was hard to come by. Some drifted to Sarnia for employment opportunities, but most remained near their families. People depended on each other, but old grudges could last years. Drinking and violent arguments often spilled over at home or at dances. Stephen Kiyoshk was born into this world on November 20th, 1891. His family was well known, though not rich. As a boy, he learned to fish, hunt, and trap. He picked up both languages, Chippewa and English. He grew up strong and quick and able to take care of himself. Kiyoshk moved between groups with skill. He could talk to anyone, a trait that helped but sometimes hurt. By early adulthood, Kiyoshk had a name people remembered. Some knew him as someone you could count on, others called him too proud. He was tall and broad, never one to step back from a fight. He could hold a grudge with the best of them. He protected his own, especially his family. There were stories of him settling scores, but also stories of him helping neighbors in anonymous ways. The world around him shaped Stephen Kiyoshk's life before 1912. He worked odd jobs, traded animal skins, played cards, and drank lots like many other men of his time. Tensions on the island were growing, and Kiyoshk's life was tied to all of it. Lines between friends and enemies weren't always clear. He stood out, for better or worse. You couldn't live long on Walpole Island or in Sarnia without knowing his name. New Year's Day, 1912, was cold on Walpole Island. The river had a thin lid of ice, and smoke curled from the wood stoves. Most people stayed home after dark. Charles Nahdee did not. He had planned a celebration in his cabin. Adam Johns came too. Charles and Adam were old friends. They got along. Flossie Williams was there, sitting close by the stove. She was younger than the men at just 15, but she was smart and quick and liked both of the men. Stephen Kiyoshk arrived sometime after dusk. A few witnesses remembered seeing him outside the cabin that day. Some said that he looked agitated. Others said he did not appear any different than usual. There had been tense words between Kiyoshk and Nahdee before, but nothing that stood out, at least not until later. Inside the cabin, drinks were passed around. The men joked, played cards, and ate what food they could share. The air was close. It was a small space for 4 people. Some accounts reported that the voices grew louder as the evening progressed. There was talk of an argument between Kiyoshk and Charles Nahdee. Some said it was about money. Others whispered it was about Flossie. No one outside the cabin heard exactly what started it. What happened next is less clear. Much of it came from Flossie herself. She spoke to the police and later to the court. She said that Stephen Kiyoshk and the others argued. Then, 2 quick gunshots broke the air. In that moment, Charles Nahdee and Adam Johns fell where they stood. Flossie survived. She was unharmed. She said that Kiyoshk was the one who had fired the gun. In the panic, Stephen Kiyoshk fled the cabin. He left Flossie behind with the bodies of these 2 men who she knew so well. Charles was shot once, and Adam at least once. Both died before help could reach them. Neighbors heard something that night. Raised voices. Was that a shot? Then stillness, but no one came until morning. Fear and old grudges often kept people from interfering, even when trouble spilled out into the open. When someone stepped into the cabin the next day, they found Flossie in shock with the 2 dead men. She was brought to a neighbor's house and then to the doctor. Word spread across the island. Almost everyone knew Charles and Adam. Their families were large and well-rooted. News traveled in whispers first, then as shouts. By the time the police came from Sarnia, most of the people on the island had gathered outside the cabin.
Yeah, people always show up after the fact, but I think on the island, that gathering probably wasn't as much about curiosity, but maybe protection. It was probably people, wanting to know what was going to happen when white authorities arrived and what they would do next.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Sure, because, as we get into later, the police came from elsewhere and the community didn't really trust them to begin with, so...
Well, the police came from elsewhere and there wouldn't be a single First Nations person in the police force back then, so...
Correct, yeah.
I wouldn't be trusting them either.
Even before the investigation started, Stephen Kiyoshk's name was already on everyone's lips. Even before Flossie spoke to the police. As we mentioned, he was known to hold grudges, and he didn't back down. He had been seen near Charles's cabin the day before, and most found it easy to believe that he could do such a thing. The police questioned Flossie. She told her story. Stephen Kiyoshk, she said, had shot both men. The local constable slowly walked through the cabin, carefully taking in the scene. It was a small space with few signs of disturbance. Only the spilled drinks, tracks in the thin snow, and the bodies, now covered, spoke to what happened. The police did not often come to Walpole Island. When they did, few expected them to take the time to sort out all the details. But this was different. 2 men had been killed, 1 woman was a witness, and 1 suspect was gone. People argued quietly outside the scene. Everyone had an opinion, and not all agreed on what happened. Some said Kiyoshk must have snapped. Others doubted Flossie's story. The island was already divided between families. Now grief and anger sat thick over the community. News reached Sarnia almost as soon as police stepped onto the island, but by the next day, headlines named Kiyoshk as the man police were seeking. The story ran as a, quote, double murder on Walpole Island. Reporters from the city calling it a shocking crime. They wrote about deadly quarrels, Indian jealousy, and, quote, rumors of revenge. Details grew wilder the further they traveled from the island. Even the national press paid attention, though most never sent anyone to Walpole to verify things. Old photographs of Walpole Island reappeared in newspapers. Reporters described it as a world apart. The story filled columns for days. Some papers described Kiyoshk as violent and vengeful. Others called him cunning, a man who fooled the police for too long. Many repeated Flossie's account as fact even before the trial began. Looks like he's going to get a fair trial.
And that's so typical of the press back then, and maybe so now, right?
Yeah.
They didn't wait. They shaped the story. They picked the villain. They built the tension before a single word of defense was heard, right? And this is theater, not justice, right?
We see that
media is theater.
We see that a lot in U.S. reporting on crime because there's more released by police over time, even before the trial takes place. Whereas here in Canada, we're very tight-lipped about what went on and with whom. And
it's much more, hey, we're hold on, we're going to get back to you once we figure this out, right?
And sometimes we don't get back to you at all because things are behind a publication ban or... Yeah, it's interesting. Canada doesn't appear we have as much of a right to know.
But there's a balance, right?
Sure there is.
There's right to know and there's just like horrible, grotesque media entertainment out of people's, the worst time in people's lives, right?
Yeah. It was said that the people on the island felt the weight of years listening from far away. For now, Stephen Kiyoshk was gone. Police searched for him in Sarnia in the surrounding area near the river. They questioned family and friends. No one would say where he'd gone if they even knew. His name was everywhere, in conversations, court records, and across the four corners of the island. By the end of that first week, Walpole Island was changed. 2 families planned burials, the cabin stood empty, police, lawyers, and neighbors were already pulling apart Flossie's story. Kiyoshk's life, as he knew it, was over, even before he was caught. The crime had the attention of people far beyond the St. Clair River. The days after the killings moved slowly. News spread along the icy roads and across the frozen river, and people whispered in houses and on porches. Most were scared. No one wanted to make the wrong guess and say the wrong name, but everyone wondered what would happen if Stephen Kiyoshk wasn't caught. Police teams, mainly from Sarnia, continued to return to the island looking for Kiyoshk and gathering more information about the murders. They questioned more people. They circled through Charles Nahdee's family and then Adam John's. They pressed Flossie Williams, going over her story and asking for details she had already provided. Flossie soon became almost as talked about as Stephen Kiyoshk himself. She stayed with relatives, rarely leaving the house.
Yeah, it sounds like Flossie sort of becomes evidence versus a person at this time, right?
Yeah.
And, that the weight of being the only survivor, for her, that weight is crushing. And you have to consider it, though, like the pressure that she was under can twist what you remember. If police keep on asking again and again and again, and everyone's talking about you, the human mind, we're not as good as remembering as we think we are.
Right. I know I'm not good at remembering things. So, anyway, thanks, inattentive ADD. Well, back to the story. There were reports of Kiyoshk being seen near Sarnia, or out by the edge of a marsh, or hiding in someone's woodshed. Some said he was trying to get as far away from Walpole Island as he could. Others were sure he had never left at all and was being hidden by family. Each story led nowhere. For most people, there was only waiting. The local papers pressed for answers. "Double murderer, still at large," read headlines in Sarnia and Chatham. Reporters wrote about the island's lawless reputation and made readers imagine Kiyoshk as a wild man in the woods. Each story made the pressure worse. The police knew they had to bring someone in or the whole area would boil over. After almost a week on the run, the break came simply. Late one day, 2 island police officers followed a fresh set of footprints along the river's snowy bank. They crept around an old boat shed, and inside they found Stephen Kiyoshk. He looked tired but didn't fight back when they raised their guns. He said nothing at first, just put up his hands and let them lead him back through the woods and onto the main road. By the next morning, everyone knew Stephen Kiyoshk was caught. He was taken to the Sarnia jail and held there. Some said he hardly spoke, except to ask for news of his family. The police told reporters they had their man. The courts set a date for the first hearing. The search was over, but the hard questions were just beginning. Flossie Williams waited to see if her story would hold up. The families of Charles Nahdee and Adam Johns prepared to relive that night in a crowded courtroom. Stephen Kiyoshk, once a free man in the woods and fields of Walpole Island, now sat in a cold cell waiting to hear what justice would look like for him.
And justice always looks different depending on who's standing in front of it. Right?
Yeah, it looks different depending on how you look.
Yeah, and for Stephen, it probably never looked like something that really included him. Justice.
Yeah. We're trying to do better with that, though. There's now restorative justice courts. A friend of mine, Kathy, who does the books for Dark Poutine, is involved in that. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, more on that at a future time. The trial of Stephen Kiyoshk became the most talked about event on Walpole Island in years. People crowded around the courthouse. Some came from Sarnia just to watch. Others made the journey from across the river. The story had left too many threads behind: questions, anger, and grief. Everyone wanted answers. The court did not move fast. It took weeks to gather witnesses, which was unusual at the time. Men in suits from Sarnia led the prosecution. They focused on what had happened in Charles Nahdee's cabin. The Crown wanted to portray Kiyoshk as violent, jealous, and seeking revenge. Their case hung on Flossie Williams, the only living witness from that night. Flossie spoke softly but did not change her story. She pointed to Kiyoshk as the man who pulled the trigger. She said loud words were traded, and then the gun flashed. Both Charles Nahdee and Adam Johns fell to the floor. Others, called to testify, said Kiyoshk had argued with Charles before in public about money and old grudges. Some said he was jealous because of Charles's attention to Flossie. Stephen wanted her for himself. The prosecution told the jury this was a crime of the heart, anger boiling over until it became murder. They pinned their case on Flossie's account and the fact that Kiyoshk had fled. There was little physical evidence. The cabin was small and nobody had seen the shooting but Flossie. But no one could ignore the dead men. Both shot at close range. The police found Kiyoshk's footprints leading away from the cabin. Charles barely moved after the first shot. Adam, who was hit second, had tried to reach the door. Blood marked his path, and no one at the scene recalled seeing any sign of any other suspect. It had to have been Stephen. Kiyoshk's lawyer argued a different story. He pointed out gaps in Flossie's tale, how her words had shifted with each telling. He said, quote, "No one else survived that night, no one to back up what she claims she saw," end quote. He suggested Charles and Adam might have been drinking too much. Fights in small cabins were not rare, he said, and guns were easier to find than peace when tempers flared. He told the jury Stephen Kiyoshk was not there to kill. Something went very wrong, but you must be sure before a man is sent to die, end quote.
And what the defense said there, that's the line. Like, you shouldn't need to prove your innocence just to stay alive.
Right.
But for an indigenous man in 1912,
yes,
that's exactly what it took. Right?
Yeah. During cross-examination, Flossie looked down at her hands. The defense pressed hard. Was it possible she did not see who fired the gun? She said, quote, "I know it was him," end quote. Kiyoshk did not speak on the stand. His lawyer said the risk was too high. Some in the gallery grumbled. Others thought silence meant guilt, not caution. The prosecution said he had run away because he was guilty as charged. The defense said he feared the law would never defend a man from Walpole Island. The trial lasted a week. Each day the courtroom filled early. Word spread through the small towns nearby and into city newspapers. Some painted Kiyoshk as a cold-blooded killer. Others were not so sure that the police had the whole story or the right man. Deep down, many could not shake old prejudices. An indigenous man on trial for murder? Few expected he would get a fair shake. The jury was mostly white men from Sarnia. They took little time to decide. The verdict came down on a cold morning. Kiyoshk was found guilty of murdering Adam Johns. For the death of Charles Nahdee, he was acquitted. The judge read out the sentence. The only available one to him for the crime at the time was death by hanging, and that's what he was sentenced to. Outside, some cheered, some wept or stared at the ground. Kiyoshk stared ahead, lips pressed tight. He didn't cry out. His family kept close, arms entwined, and left the courthouse through a side door. Reporters snapped photos and wrote brief headlines. Quote, "Walpole Island murderer sentenced to hang," end quote. The news moved fast. It left no room for grief or doubt. Inside the jail, Stephen Kiyoshk sat alone. Letters came from friends and family. Some wanted to fight the sentence. Others told him to pray and be strong. The island itself was quiet. 2 men lay in their graves. One girl, that's all she was 15, became the center of a storm. Some people hated Flossie. Stephen Kiyoshk was no longer just a name among the living on Walpole Island. He was now a man condemned to die. But his story was not over. People on both sides of the river were not ready to let it end, and appeals would follow. New questions would arise. More after a quick break. So here we are at the halfway point. Matthew, what do you have to say about this one?
What strikes me here isn't just the violence, but it's how fast people fall into the roles that they didn't choose in life. Right? Stephen becomes a villain, Flossie becomes a witness, and suddenly the system moves forward like that's all the truth that it needs. That's what it feels like to me. Yeah. And the harder truth is, this just wasn't about a murder trial in 1912. It's about how colonial systems decide whose story counts. whose voice gets trusted, whose life is already halfway written before they even step into a courtroom, you know?
Yeah.
And you know, Stephen obviously wasn't a saint, right?
Right.
But what I see is a man whose fate was shaped as much by old grudges and racism and bad press and any so-called evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the minute he ran, they stopped looking for answers and they just wanted someone to blame. And this is about what happens when justice isn't about the truth. It's about the story that sticks. You know.
Yep.
You know, what story is going to stick, and that's what we're going to call justice, right?
Yep. Stephen Kiyoshk's trial left the Walpole Island families with difficult questions and sparked a wave of concern that extended far beyond the courthouse. Kiyoshk had been convicted and sentenced to die on one of the killings, but acquitted of the other. It didn't make sense. Some people believe Kiyoshk had done it and got what he deserved. Others, both on the island and off, began to look more closely. They wondered if justice had really been served, and if the case had moved too quickly against a man already seen as guilty before he ever saw a judge. A few voices stood out in the weeks and months after the first verdict. Reverend Walter Rigsby, a well-known preacher on the island, began to speak out. He visited Stephen Kiyoshk in jail, listened to his story, and started writing letters to anyone who would read them. Reverend Rigsby didn't say Kiyoshk was innocent, but he did say he deserved a fair chance at a real defense. Quote, "A man must not hang if even the shadow of doubt remains," he wrote. Other men, like R.V. LeSueur and Nicholas Plain, joined in. LeSueur was known as a person not easily pushed around and had some sway with both people on the island and in Sarnia. Nicholas Plain was well versed in the law and began to point out mistakes in how the case had been handled. These three men, Rigsby, LeSueur, and Plain, became the backbone of efforts to get a retrial. They met with anyone who would listen in the city, sent off petitions, and pressed local leaders to reconsider the trial.
You know, that part rarely gets told, that some people fought for him.
Yeah.
Not because they knew he was innocent, but because they knew the process was broken, and I think that matters. You know, even if he's innocent or not, you know, if the process is broken, you have to stand up for the person that's being judged by a broken process.
Yeah, it's why people get off on technicalities, because maybe their rights were trampled on in some way.
Mm-hmm.
The three men investigated the case deeply and found several problems. Some witnesses reported that the police had pressured them to say certain things or leave out other facts. Flossie's account, the keystone of the Crown's case, had started to shift. On some points, she seemed less confident. Some said she was scared, others whispered she felt alone under the glare of all eyes. A few even said she was pressured too much and her nerves had cracked. There were questions about evidence not shown to the jury. Old wounds about how the courts treated indigenous people surfaced again, of course. The push worked. After months of noise in the papers and even more letters, a judge agreed to hear the case once more. The second trial came in the fall. This time, new lawyers took the stand. Some witnesses balked at what they had said before. Flossie, in her latest testimony, walked back some of what she had said. She admitted to gaps and doubts. Other pieces of evidence also did not line up as tightly as before. The case, which initially seemed so clear, began to unravel. The jury went out, but it didn't take them long. They came back and cleared Stephen Kiyoshk of all charges. He walked free. The news moved fast. Some called it justice, while others called it a mistake, but there was no going back. He'd been acquitted. Kiyoshk, free now, made a choice few saw coming. Not long after, he married Flossie Williams, the same woman whose story had put him in jail, and sentenced him to death. The local newspaper called it, quote, "the strangest wedding on Canadian soil," end quote. There were whispers everywhere. Some said it showed the truth was more tangled than the law could sort out. Others shook their heads and tried to move on. Life returned to something like normal for the families, but the marks of those days stuck to everyone. Stephen Kiyoshk and Flossie lived together on the island. The cabin where the shooting happened stood quiet for a long time. People couldn't help but watch as the couple passed by on the street. For some, it was a love story. For others, a warning. There was relief, but also deep scars, trust lost, and fears that justice depended too much on whose story won out that day in court.
Yeah, again, this whole thing isn't about evidence. This is whose version stuck.
Yeah.
The entire thing is whose version stuck. And if that's how justice works, then it's just a gamble, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, who's the best storyteller? It looks like sometimes that is still the case.
Yeah.
Who can speak to the jury and their emotions the most, because that will color their logic. For example, if the glove don't fit, you must acquit.
Yeah. Well, you and I are good storytellers. We'd never spend a day in jail.
I don't know. maybe we think that, but I don't want to test that theory. As the years passed, Walpole Island just kept going. The rivers flowed, fields changed with the seasons, and people learned to live with what had happened. Stephen Kiyoshk's name faded from the headlines, but never from the stories told late at night in rooms where only the oldest remembered every detail. The fight for a fair trial had left its mark, not just on the law, but on every family touched by that winter's violence. After his acquittal, Stephen Kiyoshk sought out a quieter life. He and Flossie's home was modest but full, set close to the water and tucked into the scrub. Work was never steady or easy, but Stephen took on whatever he could find. He fished when the river was open, trapped when the season allowed, and sometimes paddled into Sarnia to trade furs or find a day of work. Flossie kept house and walked the lanes on better days. A man named Jerry Blackbird became a steady presence in Stephen Kiyoshk's world. The two men worked together on fishing boats and small ventures, sometimes hauling in nets and sometimes taking on jobs nobody else wanted. They were close, sometimes described as friends, sometimes as uneasy business partners. For a while, the pair seemed to get by, carving out a place for themselves. Flossie's health, always delicate, began to fail more as winters passed. Sickness kept her close to home, sometimes confining her to bed for days. When she died, grief overtook Stephen Kiyoshk. He kept to himself in the weeks after. Jerry Blackbird was the only one who called, who brought him meals and sat with him. The bond with Jerry Blackbird grew stronger after Flossie's death, but all was not well. By August 1939, life had settled into the usual pattern, but by August 1939, life had settled into the usual pattern, but quiet didn't last. One day, Jerry Blackbird didn't come home. People started talking when his small boat drifted in with nobody at the oars. He was missing all night. Friends and neighbors searched the shore and called his name. No answer. Early the next day, they found Jerry's body downstream. The searchers pulled him from the weeds and shallow water. His hands were tied, and there were bruises and cuts on his head. The way he was found left no doubt someone had meant for him to stay hidden. The news traveled fast. Police came onto the island within hours, poking around the banks, peeling through Jerry's belongings, and firing off questions. The little evidence they found told a muddled story. A photograph of Flossie, old and faded, turned up in Jerry's pocket. There were blood-stained pants nearby, tucked under a log that looked too big for Jerry. Next to the water, the grass was trampled as if there had been a struggle. Some thought Jerry had tried to fight back. The little evidence they found told a muddled story. A photograph of Flossie, old and faded, turned up in Jerry's pocket. There were blood-stained pants nearby, tucked under a log that looked too big for Jerry. Next to the water, the grass was trampled as if there had been a struggle. Some thought Jerry had tried to fight back. It didn't take long for the talk to land on Stephen Kiyoshk. The men had been close, but not always easy in each other's company. Some said Stephen had grown jealous or angry in the months after Flossie's death. Others guessed that money was owed or that the business had turned sour. The police asked about Stephen straight away. He said he hadn't seen Jerry that night. Others pressed, "Where were you?" The answer was, at home drinking. Stephen claimed he slept through the night, but the police doubted him. People on the island watched every move as police made their case. Stephen was arrested a second time for murder. Many islanders had bad memories of his first trial, which had taken place nearly 30 years before. This time, the evidence was stacked higher. Witnesses talked about hearing shouts at the river after dark and seeing Stephen alone, looking dazed or drunk, just after the time Jerry disappeared. The blood-stained pants were Stephen's size, not Jerry's. Some wondered why the old photo of Flossie was with Jerry on the last night of his life.
Yeah, that photo, decades later, that's the ghost in the room, isn't it?
It really is.
Right?
Flossie haunted this case and Stephen all the way through.
It's strange. It doesn't just connect the murders. It tells you that whatever happened in 1912 never really ended.
Yeah. Word spread fast beyond Walpole Island. Papers wrote stories of a second murder and a shadow hanging over the river, end quote. Old wounds from years before reopened. Some believed Stephen Kiyoshk was guilty from the start, remembering the violence of his past. Others said the truth was still darker and more tangled than any police report. For the families, the pain and suspicion returned. There would be no peace until the law decided, again, what to do with Stephen Kiyoshk. News of Jerry Blackbird's murder and Stephen's arrest swept quickly through Walpole Island and beyond. Reporters remembered his earlier trials and the death sentence he once escaped. This new case drew stares from both old-timers and newcomers. Papers in Ontario and even across the border watched to see if Stephen would once again slip the noose. Some locals felt the case was like reopening a wound that never healed. The trial was held in Sarnia, a familiar setting for Stephen's fate. The courtroom filled fast each day. Some people had been there for the first trial 30 years before. Newcomers were more interested in the spectacle and just wanted a story to bring home. The prosecution built its case on blood and suspicion. They presented the stained pants, the photograph of Flossie found on Blackbird, and stories from people who heard shouts by the water. Their portrait of Stephen was hard and angry, a man brought low by jealousy and drink. They argued that after losing Flossie and business with Blackbird, Stephen cracked. They showed how Jerry's body was dragged to the river, tied to a boat, and pushed out alone. Stephen's defense did not deny the friendship or the arguments, but they tried to raise enough doubt. They said the men had been drinking together and that Stephen had stumbled home drunk and unable to even recall if he had left his own house that night. They called witnesses who had seen Stephen in a stupor, but cross-examination chipped away at each account. The defense also attempted to explain the bloody pants, claiming they were the result of a nosebleed or an unrelated accident. Still, every explanation seemed weaker in the face of the Crown's evidence and the old stories swirling around Stephen Kiyoshk's name.
So the last time it was whoever's story stuck, and now, his past is the evidence.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Again,
it's like the Crown didn't need proof; they just needed his reputation, and that's what makes the case stick, not fact.
Well, he was accused before, and now he's being accused again.
So it's not facts this time; it's history. So last time it was stories. Now it's history, right?
Yeah. Outside the courthouse, curiosity and rumor built. Old anger over the first trial's outcome returned in the stories told at local bars and in kitchens. Many white townsfolk assumed guilt. Many on the island watched for signs of a fair trial but feared the worst. Prejudice was always just under the surface. The jury found Stephen again guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging. The judge spoke quietly, the way judges do, but the meaning rang clear. For Stephen, it was the second time he had faced this fate. No outburst, no tears, just a hollow acceptance. When word reached Walpole Island, some grieved, others quietly nodded. Appeals started almost at once. His lawyers worked for commutation, or, at the very least, another review. A short reprieve pushed the execution back, first to November 1940, then again as the Supreme Court reviewed the case. However, even with legal assistance and new petitions, the Federal Department of Justice in Ottawa ultimately rejected the appeal. The decision was final. The day was set. On July 3, 1941, just after midnight, Stephen Kiyoshk was brought from his cell at the Lambton County Jail. He did not fight or beg. He had spent his last hours quietly eating a chicken dinner, playing cards with another prisoner, and no doubt reflecting on his life. Only a handful were allowed to witness the execution. Officials kept the curious away. Stephen did not speak before the noose tightened. According to regional reporting found in the Sarnia Historical Society and summarized in later retrospectives, quote, "The hanging of Stephen Kiyoshk was relatively painless, and he was dead within 5 minutes of dropping. He was buried at Highbanks Cemetery on Walpole Island, which is where his body remains." End quote. This would be the last execution at the old Lambton County Jail. After Stephen Kiyoshk's execution, the mood on Walpole Island and in Sarnia was mixed. Some believed justice had been done. Others felt hollow, as if nothing had truly been resolved. For the families of both Blackbird and Stephen Kiyoshk, there was only loss. Most on Walpole Island turned inward and moved on with their lives. The scars from both the 1912 and 1939 cases ran deep. Few trusted outside law, and old divides lingered. The murder cases and trials served as painful reminders of how quickly outsiders could judge and punish. Talk of the trials faded but did not disappear. People taught the stories to their children, cautionary tales about trust, friendship, and the reach of the courts. In Sarnia and other nearby towns, the story of Stephen Kiyoshk stuck mostly as a headline, another proof, so some said, of the need to, quote, keep order in wild places. But others, watching the long and tangled case, began to question whether the justice system was ever truly fair for men like Stephen. Quiet criticism built up about how the law treated indigenous defendants, how easily rumors, race, and old grudges could shape outcomes. Some felt the great distance between city justice and river life never narrowed. As time moved on, Stephen's execution became a memory, then a piece of local history spoken of less each year. But in the decades after, Canada's relationship to the death penalty also changed. Courts and lawmakers grew wary of capital sentences, especially after cases where final guilt was never apparent. In 1962, Canada witnessed its last execution by hanging. In 1976, Parliament abolished the death penalty for all civilian crimes. By 1998, capital punishment had also been removed from military law. Many look back at cases like Stephen Kiyoshk's and wonder if justice had truly been served. The case sometimes surfaced in discussions about fairness, rights, and the legacy of old prejudice. On Walpole Island, the past did not disappear. The graves, the old cabins, and the silent river still hold the story. Each new generation tries to live with that history, remembering those days of sorrow and anger, and the long shadow cast by a name that once echoed from the courthouse.
Yeah, and on a small island like this, history doesn't get filed away. Right?
No.
No, it echoes for a long time through families, and the stories stay alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like small places like this. And Stephen became a myth at this point, or maybe a warning or a scar.
Yeah. Yep. The story of Stephen Kiyoshk leaves us with hard questions. It highlights where the justice system can falter, how fear, anger, or old grudges can influence what happens in a courtroom. When the law presses forward without complete answers, lives can be ruined, families torn apart, and real wounds left behind. We remember the victims, Charles Nahdee, Adam Johns, and Jerry Blackbird. Their lives mattered, though much of what's left is only pain and silence. We also remember the families who carried that loss and the people who tried to restore justice to balance. The deaths of Charles Nahdee and Adam Johns still linger as unresolved pieces of Walpole Island's history. Though Stephen Kiyoshk was first found guilty for the death of Adam Johns and then acquitted in a second trial for both killings, the truth of what happened in Charles Nahdee's cabin on New Year's Day in 1912 has never been fully settled. Flossie Williams was the only witness, and her testimony shifted under pressure, casting doubt on every version of that night's events. Some said old arguments and tensions led to bloodshed. Others suggested details were left out or changed in fear. No one other than Stephen Kiyoshk has ever been charged or held responsible for the 1912 killings. And that's it for Dark Poutine episode 380, Twice and Again, the Walpole Island Murders. That's right, it's time for voicemails. You can leave us a message at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see who called us this week. Alrighty, so let's listen to our first voicemail.
Hey, Mike and Matt, this is Ryan. Gotta say, I love the show. I found it by accident. It came up in my recommended for you on Amazon Music, and I loved the name, so I had to check it out. gotta say I'm not disappointed. I've listened to the first 200, and then I started listening to the newest ones and just let my player play backwards. I just got done listening to the Gay Purge in Canada episodes, and it was pretty awful. But I got a story for you. Here in Springfield, there's a gay bar called the Why Not 3. We've been there with a good friend of ours, Eugene. She was dating my wife's best friend of 35 years, mom, and she was a drag queen, so we would go there to support her in her shows and do all that. And it's called the Why Not 3 because it was vandalized and burnt down twice. So the owner took the sign down, and now it's just a green building. So if you don't know what it is, you wouldn't know what it is. And, you know, it's pretty crazy, but I figured Matt would appreciate that. And anyways, love the show. And as always, go take a shit in your hat.
That's kind of awesome. I love
you, Ryan.
Yeah, so why not 3? Like, okay, why not let's try again? Why not make it the third time?
yeah. So Springfield, that's near Dayton, Ohio.
Dayton, Ohio.
He sounds like he's calling from Ohio. I think he works at Cedar Point, Ohio.
Oh, what's he do there?
The Gemini. He runs the Gemini roller coaster.
Okay,
that was
that's
my
fun.
favorite roller coaster when I was a kid.
The Gemini.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever been on it.
It was 2 different roller coasters, a red one and a blue one, and it was like you had a race, and there was like it went upside down and stuff like that.
Oh, that's really fun.
Yeah, it was cool.
That is kind of cool. Alrighty, let's listen to our last voicemail here. There's 3.
Hi there, this is Melissa calling from Saskatoon. I wanted to just say how great I think your podcast is. And I wanted to share a connection that I have to a case kind of tangentially in Saskatoon. In 2010, there was a woman named Karina Wolf that went missing. And her body was not found for 5 years. A year after she went missing, I was working in a homeless shelter and encountered her mother, who was deaf. And all I can remember, the thing I remember the most, is sitting at that table with that woman whose daughter at that point was missing, and holding her hand with one of my hands and signing "I'm sorry" with the other. 10 years have passed since they found her. There has been a conviction, but it still is haunting to me. And I've encountered her mother since then in the Sisters in Spirit walk. And the strength that she shows continually, even now, is just phenomenal. What a phenomenal woman she is. Anyway, that's all I got. Take a poop in your toque. Take care.
Thank you so much. So I looked this case up while you were talking, and Karina, Karina Wolf, and spelled it's Wolf with an E. She was an indigenous woman who was murdered there in Saskatoon, and the story looks horrific. I've added it to our list of possible episodes. So it's really, really, that one is really awful. Anyway, thank you for calling. I love it that people are able to talk so seriously and end with "go poop in your toque" or something like that. It just shows that, they understand where we're coming from.
Yeah, and I'm not going to give Melissa a job. It sounds like Melissa does some really cool shit for people in Saskatoon.
Yeah, so we don't want to limit her in any way.
No, I don't want to limit her. I think whatever she's doing, it sounds pretty cool.
Darn cool.
Pretty useful. Yeah.
Yeah. That's it for this week's voicemails. Again, you can leave us one at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you, even if it is just to say hi and to tell us to go shit in our hats. If you're stumped for what to chat with us about, a quick story is welcome. Alrighty. We have a patron this week. Another new patron. Wowzers. And
yay, Patreon.
That person is named Alana Lowe. And Alana, she is from South Maitland, Nova Scotia. There, it's just south of Maitland is South Maitland. It's in Hants County, and it's close to Truro and that kind of thing. Just above Stewiacke and Shubenacadie. Those places, Matthew. Alana Lowe, from my stomping grounds. I love it when Nova Scotians support us. It really, really warms the cockles of my cold, dead heart. What do you think Alana does there in South Maitland, Nova Scotia, Matthew?
I think she produces ambient music.
Ambient Alana Lowe.
Alana Lowe, ambient music producer.
Alana Lowe's ambient music. This ambient music brought to you by Alana Lowe. Alana Lowe.
See, it works, doesn't it?
It does work. Thank you, Alana Lowe.
Alana Lowe.
From Maitland, Nova Scotia.
Coming at you from Maitland, Nova Scotia.
Coming at you from the wilds of Maitland, Nova Scotia. With some chill sounds is Alana Lowe. Thanks to all our patrons and Donut Money donors, past and present, for your generosity. It helps to keep the show going. You can become a patron of Dark Poutine at patreon.com/darkpoutine. For a one-time donation, you can send us donut money via PayPal or interact using our email address, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com. If you don't already subscribe to the show, it would mean a lot if you did. You can easily find Dark Poutine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. If you haven't gotten yours yet, my 2 books are available to order via links on the Dark Poutine website or anywhere fine books are sold. And speaking of darkpoutine.com, check it out for show notes and other cool stuff. We'd appreciate it if you gave Dark Poutine a like or a follow on Facebook and Instagram. Most importantly, thank you for listening. Tell your friends about us. Word of mouth is a powerful thing. And that's it for this episode of Dark Poutine, so until next time, don't forget to be a good egg and not a bad apple.
This is Alana Lowe signing off.
Oh dear.